Hey, it's Abdul. Welcome to another video in the BIOSTATS CRUSH course. Today, we're going to be going over the measures of dispersion. Jumping onto the basic core concepts of this topic, we can remember how we spoke about descriptive statistics last time, and the whole idea of trying to make sense of our very chaotic data. One way of doing that is through our measure of central tendency, which tells us how our data is clustered. Measures of dispersion are very heavily interlinked with this, but in a different way. It tells us something else. What measures of dispersion do is they tell us how clustered our data is around our measure of central tendency. Now, this can be a bit confusing to get your head around, so the best way to get through this is through a goofy example. So recently I've picked up a little game called Stardew Valley. After losing too many games of League and raging way too hard, I decided to play this game with my wife, and it's amazing. I'm having so much fun with it. I love to sit down and farm, just have my own little kind of crops going around. So I was having fun for a while. And just like chatting with the villagers. Life was good until a very kind of awkward exchange with my homeboy Lewis. Now obviously you can disrespect me, you can disrespect my family, but you do not disrespect my goddamn corn. So obviously I did not agree to these very blasphemous statements about my corn, so I decided to do a little mock trial to compare and see who has the bigger corn. So both me and Lewis decided to take a sample of 50 ears of corn from each one of our fields and weigh out each corn and kind of log it down. And at the end of our little exercise of fruits of labor, I find out that the average corn that I had weighed around 400 grams, aka the mean of my corn was 400 grams, and weirdly enough, the mean of Lewis's corn was also 400 grams. So the monkey of questioning asks, who has the heavier corn? At this point in time, the answer cannot be answered because we're just comparing means and we have identical means. So we open up our raw data and we look at the raw data for each one of my corns compared to his, and it's really hard to say. They do look very similar, and without directly comparing one to the other, we decided to use something a bit different. We decided to use something called the standard deviation. The standard deviation is a measure that quantifies the amount of variation within the data set. It basically tells us how much individual data points deviate from the mean of the data set. So look at this scenario. Imagine all 50 of the corn weighed exactly 400 grams. As in, there was no deviation from the mean. This is going to be a standard deviation of 0. And obviously that's very perfect. That means our mean is just right there. All the data is clustered around that singular point. And it's just wow. Unfortunately, life is not as beautiful, so things don't usually have a standard deviation of 0. Moving on to scenario 2, you could say that yeah, most of my corn were 400, that's why it's the mean, but there were equally some corn that were 380 grams and others that were 420 grams. So this is an example of a mean of 400 grams, but a standard deviation of around 20 grams. Looking at another scenario, this time on the right, you can see that this has a wider spread of variation. The most common or the most frequent corn weight is 400 grams, but you could see how I have corn that goes up to 440 grams and corn that goes all the way down to like 320 grams. The deviation from that mean is much wider, and you can see this from the standard deviation. It is 40 grams in scenario 3. Not as beautiful as my diagrams, but this is another example of a chart that shows you how standard deviations look like. The graph with the narrower width, that's a graph with lower standard deviation, and that graph which is a bit kind of like sloped wider has a higher standard deviation. So going back to our little beef with Lewis, we look back at our raw data and you can see we both have the same mean. However, things look a bit different when we look at the standard deviation. My standard deviation is around 6.1 grams. Lewis's standard deviation is around 139 grams. So he has some crazy inconsistency with his standard deviation. And when we look at his data in a bit more detail, we can see that one of his corn weighed a whopping 1,000 grams, a kilogram gigacorn, and that kind of completely skewed his data and led to a wider standard deviation. So that's standard deviation for you. Unfortunately, this is kind of a bit too simple for the MBME's liking, so they like to test this topic in a slightly different way. And to answer those questions, we have to introduce ourselves to something called the 68, 95, 99.7 rule. Now, this rule is a bit of a mouthful, but honestly, this is one of the most frequently asked questions by MBME in this topic. So it's really super high yield. What this rule is, it's a kind of like belief that if you have data that is normally distributed, 68% of that data will fall within one standard deviation. 95% of your data will fall under 2 standard deviations, and 99.7% of your data will fall within 3 standard deviations. And this diagram kind of summarizes exactly what we just said. Again, 68% of your data will fall within 1 standard deviation, 95% of your data will fall within 2 standard deviations, and 99.7% of your data will fall within 3 standard deviations. Now, the way how MBME tests these concepts, they will either give you the mean and standard deviation for a data set, then give you a data point and ask you, hey, what's this percentile? Or they could ask it in a bit more of an advanced manner, and we're going to go through both of these scenarios when we go through our solved questions in section 2. So for our first example, we have kled's shrooms. So homeboy kled here has decided to go into a professional venture and sell some of his medicinal mushrooms that promise to empower you with strength and courage. Now, looking at his stock, the mean weight of one of his mushrooms is around 60 grams with a standard deviation of 2.5 grams. Now, the question that they're asking you here is, you buy a mushroom from kled that weighs 65 grams. What percentile is it? Now, the clue to answering any MBME question related to measures of dispersion is to never forget the 68, 95, 99.7 rule. So step number 1, remember the rule, write it down on a piece of paper, doesn't matter. Step number 2 to approach these questions is to draw a rough distribution curve. Now, during the exam, you're going to have a whiteboard, so this is the perfect time to use it. You draw a rough distribution curve like this, and you can see you draw a normal distributed data, 60 grams being right at the middle because that's your mean, and then you just write it down up to 3 standard deviations. I recommend going up to 3 standard deviations. Maybe you may not have to go that far up, but usually it's just kind of like safer. So on the right hand side, you could see if the standard deviation is going to be 2.5 grams, that means, 62.5 grams is going to be 1 standard deviation, 65 grams is going to be 2 standard deviations, etc. And you fill this up for both above and below the mean. And then step 3, you identify your data point within the graph. In this case, they said that the mushroom is 65 grams, which means it's going to be 2 standard deviation above the mean. Then you link it with the formula. So if it's within 2 standard deviations, right, that means that 95% of our data will fall within this 2 standard deviation, which means that if 95% of our data is confined within 2 standard deviations, that means 5% of our data is going to be greater than 2 standard deviations. And that 5% will be obviously divided into 2 because one of it, so 2.5%, will be greater than 65 grams and 2.5% will be less than 55 grams. So if that makes sense, this is going to be that 5% divided by 2. And then you ask yourself, right, where are we at in this step? So if we know that our mushroom is 65 grams, that means it's on the upper limit. So it's going to be that upper 2.5%. And then we just do a simple math. We do 100 minus 2.5, you get 97.5. So this mushroom, a 65 gram mushroom, is going to be at the 97.5th percentile. So this is one format of questions that the MBME might ask. Very unusual. The more common option is going to be number 2, but it's always very useful to be familiar with answering these kind of questions. Now moving on to the second example, which is a bit more advanced. It's called Count Caligula's Revenge, right? So Kled's grand uncle from his maternal side decides, hey, this mushroom business seems to be quite good. Time to kind of do the same thing. This time he's selling a different strain called Pink Madness. So the question is this. Mushrooms smaller than 25 grams are not bought by customers, right? It's too small to be bought. Most people are like, no, I'm good. So they are considered inferior quality by his uncle. So in a sample of 1,000 mushrooms, how many will be of inferior quality, assuming that the mean weight of your mushrooms are 30 grams and you have a standard deviation of 5 grams. Your approach would be the very same as before. Step 1, you remember the 68, 95, 99.7 rule. Step 2, you draw a rough distribution curve and you try to fill it up to 3 standard deviations on either side. Once that's done, you're able to just start thinking about it more logically and try to apply what we know. We know that mushrooms smaller than 25 grams are not bought. And 25 grams in our graph is going to be 1 standard deviation below the mean. And we know that 68% of our data will be within 1 standard deviation of our mean. So that means that 32% of our data will be greater or less than 1 standard deviation of our mean. So 16% of our data will be higher than 1 standard deviation, and 16% of our data will be lower than 1 standard deviation. In this case, the data is just going to be simply mushrooms. And we're interested here in the 16% that is going to be lower than 1 standard deviation. So that means 16% of our stock will be too small and will be considered inferior quality. Then you just do 16% of 1,000, you get 160. So the answer to that question is 160 mushrooms will be considered inferior quality. So this is the other style of questions that they might ask, and this is how I would personally approach those questions. Now moving on to the last section of this video and seeing how things apply in practice. And the truth is, honestly, measures of dispersion are absolutely everywhere. Open up any journal and you're going to see some sign or some degree of measures of dispersion, just because it's so important in making sense of our data. Measures of dispersion are also a great way to understand your mean within the perspective of your sample. For example, this is the results of a science trial by Dan Perry, the GOAT. And in this study, they looked at kids with medial epicondyle fractures, and they looked at patients who were treated with surgery versus non-surgery and compared them. And you can see this is the age between the two groups, and you can see we have the mean. So the non-surgical group had a mean age of 11.6 years with a standard deviation of 2.4. So, and it's very similar to the surgical fixation group with 11.8 and a standard deviation of 2.1. In another study, completely different, you will notice how in this case, the standard deviation in this adult population is around 13.2 years. And the mean age is around 32.2. So it kind of gives you a great way of comparing similar studies, and it gives you a lot of data regarding a lot of information about how well has that study been randomized, and it allows you to better understand the data that you are seeing in that journal. So measures of dispersion are going to be everywhere you look. It's a very core fundamental of everything that is biostats. And with that, thank you so much for listening. We have reached the end of measures of dispersion. It kind of did drag a bit long, honestly, but I did really want to give you guys a fun example to really understand things pretty well and go through some of the commonly asked questions by MBME. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. If you did enjoy this video, please leave a like, comment if you have any suggestions or any questions, subscribe and hit that bell icon to get notifications the moment I drop a deuce. And if you are interested in mentoring, whether it's for step 1, step 2, the Canadian exams, the British exams, reach out to me. I think the first 5 members who use the code KLED, that is KLED, will get 20% off their first mentorship session. Well, with all that said, thank you so much for listening and wishing you a great one.